Thank you for this wonderful presentation. At the very beginning, I would like, first of all, to express my gratitude towards the Foundation for inviting me, and also express my gratitude towards Center for Capitalism, which supported my presentation here today. So the topic of my speech is, should we switch the liberal argument? And this topic, the whole issue, comes from an observation that liberals seem to be losing politically and also losing the arguments in the last couple of years. And I think there are good reasons for that. And also I think we need to understand what is the driving force. But before starting to speak about the supposed reasons for that, I would like to also stress that what I'm going to say is a bit still hypothetical. It is a work in progress, it is a hypothesis, and also it is strongly influenced by two people, first of which is Steve Davies from Institute of Economic Affairs in London, which I really recommend reading and observing and following in any way you like, because he's a brilliant mind, really. And his book on the topic I'm going to speak about right now is forthcoming. It will be issued in November or in December. I don't know the title yet, but still recommend having some interest in that book. I'm sure it will be wonderful. Also, Arnold Klink from Cato Institute is a person who, to some extent, inspired me to well, consider some of these topics and well, understand that they are important. Okay, so in the last couple of years, we have experienced that the political scene has been changing really, really fast. And we had a couple of comments here during the previous talks about the rise of nationalist populism and similar movements. These movements are typically presented in the mainstream media as right-wing populism. I think many of you have heard this name. Well, this is in our post-war, at least post-war history, it is a rather new experience, I would say. Especially the extent of this phenomenon is something that we haven't faced in the last couple of decades. Some people think that these very movements, right-wing populists, also to some extent so-called left-wing populists, are a temporary phenomena that they are driven by the fact that some people, especially low-paid workers, unskilled labor, migrants, for instance, but especially people from post-industrial cities, for instance, were left by the governments alone. They got frustrated to some extent, and they started to vote radical movements. But as soon as the politicians will take care of these people, these right-wing populist movements will cease to be. I honestly don't think it's true. I think the driving force of these developments is a more fundamental, I would say, and it is a persistent thing. I think what we are going to see in a couple of decades is a switch of the political debate, of the main axis amongst which the debate is being run. So if we can visualize a bit how it was in the last 3, 4, 5 decades, we can do it by using this famous Nolan diagram. Invented by David Nolan, a libertarian author, which basically says that there are two axes of political spectrum. First of which is economic freedom, or attitudes toward economic freedom. So we have econ freedom here. or economic liberty, and here we have so-called personal liberty. Yeah. So I think everyone is more or less familiar with that picture, and I honestly think it more or less precisely depicts what has been happening in the European politics, in the Western politics, but also in the American politics in the last couple of decades. And here we can say that not only this diagram is accurate, but it also allows us to depict the main two forces that were competing between each other since late 60s at least. So around here were Christian Democrats, which were more or less pro-market people, and in terms of culture or personal liberty, they were moderately conservative, I would say. And on the other hand, we had social democrats somewhere here. When my interest in politics began, like in 2012, this picture was extremely fine to describe the political scene. We had this sort of political divisions everywhere in Europe, also in the US, in France, in Germany, everywhere, even in Poland, which is a post-communist country. This, to some extent, described here in the social democratic part, there was this post-communist party, and here in the Christian democratic part, there was this post-solidarity movement, I would say. And now, what was the liberal case like in this setting? Well, liberals, of course, are pro-freedom, right? In both senses, but especially they were pro-economic freedom. On the other hand, several cultural arguments made by this, made along this axis of the spectrum were, I mean, in several respects, the conservative side of this axis was more appealing to liberals, like the virtue of temperance, for instance, or propensity to save, some sort of scrutiny, of austerity, excuse me. All of these values were appreciated, and are appreciated, of course, by liberals. Therefore, liberals, which I would say were somewhere here, tended to be associated with Christian Democrats, so with the right at the time. No, I think, oh yeah. So the natural ally of liberals were Christian Democrats. I think many of us will agree. But what we need to understand is that this picture is not timeless, in the sense that it is not independent of a historical period in which we live. Actually, when we imagine, for instance, a similar diagram for 19th century, we could say that totally different axes can be proposed. We can say that in the 19th century, when the conservative authoritarian forces were in power, we can imagine a different axis. For instance, likeness for authoritarianism versus democracy or something similar. And on the other hand, clericalism versus secularism. I'm not saying that this picture precisely describes the 19th century political spectrum, but I'm saying that this would better describe what was happening there. It would allow you to structure the political movements of that era much better than the Nolan chart. So the underlying argument that was made in that time was rather this one. So these two things, the preferred system of government, so the amount, the extent to which ordinary people can participate and shape policies, this was one of the driving issues there at that time. And on the other hand, of course, the role of religion and clerical forces, right? And the argument I am trying to make is that what we are observing right now is a similar shift from this Nolan chart to some very, very different sort of political scene. What is what we can infer from that is that actually those right-wing populist parties will likely not be very populist in the long run. They will somehow enter the mainstream, and this is actually already happening. This is happening, for instance, in Poland and in Central Europe in general, when we have new kind of right-wing movements which are totally mainstream, like the ruling party in Poland, like the Fidesz, the party of Viktor Orban, and many others which are either aspiring to become the government, or they already are in governments. I don't think it is ephemeral, this emergence of right-wing movement. And why? This is because the new political spectrum, or the new sort of structuring the political scene is to some extent driven by considerations of identity. We have people who say that identity, first of all, is something that is essentially public. It is a matter of public policy to define overall identity of people, for instance, nationality, but also religion, but also other kind of symbols, which shouldn't be left to the free market forces that freely interact with those factors and shape the way people are behaving, people are feeling about their identity, and so forth and so on. Of course, other people who will be somewhere here in the bottom of this spectrum claim just the opposite, that identity is basically a private issue, that people should be allowed to define their identity to a large extent in a freely shaped manner and so forth. But these people here, actually, these people who claim that our identity is something that should be defended by a political sphere or by political actors, they are pretty new in this sense that even though these opinions existed for a couple of decades, this axis was never a main axis of political divisions or political arguments, as it is becoming right now. This is my hypothesis. And why is that? Well, I think the most obvious explanation is that the power of globalization these days and the changes globalization is making to the world right now has never been experienced before. Globalization, so free flow of goods, of services, of capital, and of people as well, so migration, a topic that was already touched in a couple of previous talks, is reshaping the world in which we are living at a pace that we didn't even think to experience like 12 years ago. There are estimations that 70% of children born right now will be working in professions that don't even exist at the moment they are born. This is, of course, happening due to flow of information, flow of people, flow of capital, due to the overall economic development that is conditional, of course, to a large extent on the globalization. But on the other hand, it brings to our lives a serious amount of instability and insecurity. And this insecurity, by the way, is distributed unequally amongst the society. So So there are people who benefit from this wave, the newest wave of globalization. There are professional people, people who anyway interact with the global community, who work in professions similar to mine, for instance, who have colleagues from India, from America, Germany, China, everywhere in their workplace anyway. But on the other hand, there are some people who are losing in the short term, of course, because as many economists dealing with the issues of international trade, for instance, accurately point out, short-term adjustment costs of opening your country to free trade flows, for instance, are sometimes substantial. People need to acquire new competences, for instance, because they are out-competed by cheaper labor force from a country they don't even know that exists. Or those people come to their original countries, like, for instance, now people from Pakistan or from India or from Ukraine come to Poland, and they are very competitive on the labor market, of course, because they are able to accept living standards that are unacceptable for Polish citizens, typically. So, for instance, they can live in 10 men in one flat. No Polish family would accept it in the first place, but people from Ukraine or from Bangladesh do. So, in order for Poles who are low-skilled workers to acquire a better job, it is necessary to acquire some new competences and basically to change their life completely. So this sense of insecurity, I think, is driving the development of new political spectrum. On one axis, we have this identity issue. The question is, how many other axes will there be, and what axes will there be? I think the first there are some possible solutions. I'm not sure what is going to emerge at the end. One possible solution is economic integration, which is of course strongly related to that aspect, but it's not identical. So we can say economic integration, but also perhaps it may be an attitude towards democracy. So perhaps here we would have democracy and here authoritarianism. I don't know, but what is to me obvious is that if this hypothesis is correct, this axis will be the driving force. So there are people already who claim that, as I said, stable identity is a fundamental of a healthy society. Which is basically a view that was already expressed by many philosophers and authors in the history, but I don't really think it was the main issue of political spectrum in the past, and this is now becoming a very fundamental question. Of course, to this identity we should count nation, or the sense of nationality, which is to a larger extent, especially in Central Europe, but also in the West, becoming a public issue. So it is no longer your private opinion, whether you're Polish or whether you're German and so forth. It is now becoming an element of public sphere. Also, the way you treat some symbols, like national heroes, right, religious symbols, the way the extent to which you identify with those symbols. This is becoming an issue, and this is also something that public powers, public authorities are trying to protect, to strongly influence. And along these lines, of course, there comes another issue, pretty related, which is, well, economic nationalism, I would say, or rather protectionism. Or, even better, this sort of protectionism that was developed by people like Alexander Hamilton or Friedrich List in the past, which is basically about promoting so-called national champions. So domestic companies which to some extent symbolize the power of domestic economy. This is a topic very lively discussed in Poland right now. This is exactly the answer to this question about nationalization that was asked, well, at 11 or something during this panel, right? So this is something I would say is really possible to be explained by this hypothesis that it is not that important whether this nationalization or Polonization actually is economically efficient, because it is not about efficiency of those companies that are acquired, but rather about making them Polish and not foreignly owned. So this is why actually I think it's called Polonization. Of course, nationalism is biased. I mean, nationalization is a word that's biased. I mean, no one wants to speak about nationalization anymore. So this is one cause for this being called Polonization. But another cause, I think, is that people get this feeling that the national pride is to some extent boosted by these acquisitions, that large companies are becoming Polish right now. And it is not only, by the way, happening in Poland. I'm, of course, most familiar with the Polish examples and I'm referring to it every time, but exactly the same is happening in the US, I believe. So the Trump movement, or the President Trump and his followers, so to say, I think he is a manifestation of the same tendency. So people in the US are to some extent, at least some people in the US are to some extent hesitant towards globalization in its current form, and also they feel that things are changing so fast that the identity must be protected, that there are symbols that actually, if are not protected, would be dissolved altogether by the forces of globalization. There is, of course, the whole migration topic as well in the US, the free trade topic, as you, of course, know better than I do. And now, what follows for the liberal argument right now? Because the purpose of making this speech is to somehow suggest that because of these developments, we should perhaps rethink our argument and adjust it to this new situation. And this is actually, I mean, lack of understanding of this topic, or some sort of, well, lack is perhaps not the proper word, but failure to fully acknowledge the importance of this development, of the fact that actually the new divisions between political groups or political parties will go rather along some lines that are similar to those depicted here, rather than those old lines. So there is no more pro-market right wing and welfare state left wing. It's not that simple anymore. This is why I think the liberals right now have some problems, and that the political discourse is very, very far away from any sort of liberal considerations. So, what is my view on these topics? Of course, I am an observer rather than a participant of these things. I'm not, unlike many of you here, I'm not a pro-liberal activist. Right now I'm a management consultant, so I observe these developments from outside to some extent. But perhaps it's a fresh view and therefore worth knowing. Well, I think that we can say that 2 points emerge from that picture. First of all, that our arguments that since 40s or 50s were mainly developed around economic issues. So we were defending free market as an institution that allocates resources in the best possible manner, that works more efficiently than welfare state or socialist economy works. It is not that powerful anymore, because the economic topics, of course, are present here, but only as a part of some other issues. Typically, they are not independent. Typically, many people can accept many of liberal arguments, but then refuse to admit their strength just because they don't deal with these identity issues here. We can say, okay, free capital flows increase the overall welfare, which is correct, but there are people and there are values which are hurt, so it is not worth the effort to allow for free capital flows, for instance. For me, it is very obvious that many people think like that, and many parties and many political movements in Europe, in the US, actually understand that there is a widespread feeling of this issue, that many people think in this way. Of course, they were always thinking this way, but now this topic is becoming the driving force. So they know the momentum, right? So this is one thing. We should rely a bit less on purely economic arguments. We should address somehow this identity issue. And by the way, I think we should, just like the liberals from the 19th century, which were also fighting against some sort of reactionary right in the first place, so against monarchs, against aristocrats. They were pro-democratic in the sense that they preferred some democratic rule, bounded by constitution and so forth, naturally, to the autocratic rule, right? So similarly, we should say that identity is not a public, not a public question. This is something that is defined on individual level, and by the way, that symbols cannot be used politically. That every one of us has some symbols which, with which he or she identifies, right? And it is his private business what he does with the symbols and how the symbolical world of our symbolical civilization develops. It can be changed fundamentally by other factors. It shouldn't be politically managed. Otherwise, we would be almost, I would say, we would not be very present in this main underlying debate that I believe is going to happen quite soon. And the second thing, apart from this switching the argument to this onto this identity track, is my suggestion that perhaps we should rethink our alliance with the right. It was natural, as I showed earlier, excuse me. It was quite natural for us liberals to associate with the right, so with the Christian Democrats. But it's no longer the case, I think. I think the right is actually somewhere here right now. So it's slowly but consistently moving toward this pro-identity politics. And of course, there are some people who say, okay, from the very beginning, I was arguing for the same thing. I was supporting free markets, I was supporting capital flows, I was supporting migration, for instance, and many other issues, just because it was good for our people, for Poles, for Germans, for French people, from British, for Americans. It was a good way to make our country prosperous and great. But since now, it's not that obvious that those instruments work for us anymore. We can quit with that. So we can apply different policies, and therefore this fundamental identity and greatness of ours will be preserved. So there are people who actually claim that the market solutions were only some sort of tool. The question is whether we want to continue this route, on this route or not? I think that we should really rely, as the liberals did throughout the history, on individualistic values and say, well, in this spectrum, we are somewhere in the bottom, right? And we should really strongly underlie it at every occasion, because this will be probably one of the most important discussions that are going to happen in the following decades or so. Thank you very much, because now it's
I think that we have time for one very, very short question and very, very short answer. Mary.
Yes. Could you give us a concrete example of how we might make an argument using this identity? You had suggested we do that. Can you give a concrete example, please?
Well, I already mentioned something in the course of my presentation. For instance, there are people who say that some elements of identity are fundamentally, cannot be fundamentally changed. For instance, there are always been some nationalities right now. In the course of history, right? And states have been always protecting these nationalities from foreign threats, right? Countries were competing even very cruelly, brutally on the international scene, right? So they believe, many people believe and seem to believe more and more that there is a fundamental structure of the world that cannot be changed in an easy way. And if someone attempts to change the structure, something really bad will happen, like the society would collapse. So we cannot let migrants in, for instance, we cannot dissolve government from certain tasks and so on, so release them. Yeah? So what we can be arguing for is, we can say, no, the change is something natural, and actually many times in the history those factors were not present. They are quite a new factors, like the nation state is a new factor, nationality is a new factor, and nationality, by the way, can also pass away at some time, right? It's nothing that we should fear, right? It's a temporary phenomenon. I don't know whether this argument will be very powerful, but I think if we don't make these identity arguments, if we don't start making them quite early, we should be left somewhere in the discussion behind other actors who will actually address those popular feelings much better than we do.